EDC Zen Knife Spotlight is the Kobold 2.0, manufactured by Kizer Cutlery out of Guangzhou, China. Not everybody agrees, but Chinese OEMs today are some of the best manufacturers from a value perspective, and I think Kizer offers some of the best value even amongst their competition. For most of their basic models, Kizer uses G10 or micarta for the scales, and 154 cm for the blade steel. The model that we're looking at here is slightly more premium, so let's look at the specs. Regarding the blade, the length is overall 3.6 inches, and because of the shape, that's almost all cutting edge. I maybe shave off 0.1 inch and call it 3.5 inch cutting edge. The blade steel is CPM 4V, which I've found has a pretty good balance of blade toughness and edge retention. However, CPM 4V is not a true stainless steel, so please be careful to keep your blades dry and well oiled. The blade shape is a, modified Wharncliffe or sheep's foot, depending on what you want to call it. That's a pretty good knife shape for utility cuts and just general all-purpose use. The style of the blade is black stonewashed, which I found Kizer does pretty well. I think the black stonewash looks good and also helps a little bit with the corrosion resistance, which, considering the 4V isn't complete stainless steel, it's a pretty nice style to include on this blade, I think. The blade stock is relatively long and thin. It almost reminds me of the Benchmade 940 Osborne. It features a 2/3 flat grind, and it does get pretty thin behind the edge. The handle material features stainless steel black liners, and on top of the liners are two black anodized pieces of aluminum. Generally, Kizer does a pretty good job with their anodization, and these black scales are no exception. They look particularly beautiful in the direct sunlight, I think. You can still see the black color, but a sort of rainbow sheen from the aluminum underneath shines through. One noteworthy thing about these scales is the thickness of the aluminum, which is both a positive and a negative thing in my opinion. On the positive side, the two aluminum scales combined with the steel liners give the handle a 3/4 inch thickness, which is really comfortable to hold in the hand, especially in a hammer grip or any kind of grip where the middle of your palm is making contact with the scales. It really fills out the hand nicely. On the other hand, it is kind of a chunker. It's bordering on what I would consider to be a practical EDC knife because of the width of this handle combined with the length. It doesn't really fit in the pocket perfectly. Let's move on to talking about my experiences using and carrying this blade for the last few months. The first thing I want to talk about is the aesthetics of this knife, which I think are just really great. I think the knife just looks cool, it looks unique, and it has a very original design that I've never seen on any other pocket knife. I didn't really know the first time I looked at it, but Kizer does draw attention to this if you look on their website. The Kobold, too, it's named after a I guess a kobold is probably from Dungeons and Dragons. It's some high fantasy setting. And they are usually dragonkin. So the designer for this knife, Sebastian Irawan, he designed it to look like the head of a dragon. And combined with the black stone-washed blade and the black anodized aluminum scales, it does really give off the impression of like a black dragon head, both in the closed position and in the open position, which I think is really neat. I'm really into when a designer sticks with a theme and executes it well like they did with this blade. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, to make a thematic blade, but recently Kizer's been putting out a lot, and this one just doesn't disappoint at all. The design language, it's very interesting to look at, it's very interesting to hold. There's a lot of lines which are not just aesthetic, they're also functional. It gives you a lot of different places to grip onto in the handle. But when you look at it from far away, it gives it a kind of movement, a dynamic feeling when you look at it. The next thing I want to talk about is the action. And oh boy, does this have really good action. Between the thumb hole and the front flipper, you have a lot of different ways to open the blade, which makes it very fidgety. And while it's not quite drop shutty, it is very smooth. On top of that, it has a very what I would call the optimal medium detent. And what I mean by that is it's very easy to open the blade slowly with your thumb. Some detents, if they're too hard, you kind of have to pinch it with 2 fingers in order to open it. With this blade, you feel almost no resistance when you open it with your thumb. But it's still snappy enough to fly open when you use the front flipper. Another thing we should talk about, and I mentioned it a little bit already, is the blade shape. Now, the sheep's foot blade, it's very good for utility and draw cuts. And as I said, the blade stock is fairly thin. So I find this knife is especially good for cutting very cleanly, slicing very cleanly through materials such as cardboard, paper, canvas, and cloth. However, while it is pretty easy to make a lot of utility cuts with the blade, I would say that the tip, it's not ideal for making really precise, scalpel-like precise cuts. Additionally, it's not the best puncturer in the world. So I think that it's good for what you would usually use a pocket knife for in your everyday work, like breaking down cardboard or cutting up pieces of paper from a notebook or something like that. But it's not necessarily the kind of blade shape that you'd want to bring on a camping expedition or bushcrafting. It's definitely not built for that kind of use. One final little nuance that I'd like to point out about this knife is that the blade, it's a little bit dangerous when you're closing it. Now, a lot of new Kizers have a double clutch, or they have a large finger choil, so that when you're closing the knife, the blade doesn't have any danger of making contact with your thumb. However, the Kobold 2.0, the blade goes almost all the way to the base of the knife, the front of the handle. So you have to be really careful when you're closing. You must depress the liner with your finger and make sure that you don't let the blade drop down on your thumb, because if you sharpen it enough, that will leave a nice little gash in your thumb knuckle. Overall, I'd say I was very impressed, and I continue to really enjoy the Kobold 2.0. It even makes it into the top 5 favorite Kizers list for me. And although it's not practical, it's not the knife that I carry the most. Whenever I pick it up, I can't seem to put it down. I love to manipulate it, I love to look at it, and overall I just think it's a great knife to have in my collection.